In 2017, a reckoning over sexual violence swept the globe under the hashtag MeToo. 8 years later, has the MeToo movement done enough for survivors? And what will it take for the world's most powerful men who face sexual misconduct charges to finally be held accountable? This week on UpFront, I'll ask those questions to the founder of the MeToo movement, longtime activist Tarana Burke. Tarana Burke, thank you so much for joining me on UpFront.
Thank you for having me.
You started the MeToo movement 20 years ago to support survivors of sexual violence. Mm-hmm. About a decade later, the hashtag MeToo went viral, with millions of people around the world sharing their experiences about sexual assault, sexual harassment, and other things as well. Mm-hmm. How has the movement grown from the first time that you wrote those words down until today?
Oh, man. It has grown in ways that I thought I would never see, actually. So when I was doing this work in the early 2000s, late 90s, it was really hard to even get people to talk about sexual violence, and certainly not in the public sphere, right? It's the thing that we whisper about. It's the thing that we maybe can have one-to-one conversations about, but I could not dream about or visualize a day when we would have sustained public conversation about sexual and gender-based violence. So that's one way it's grown. I mean, just exponentially. Across the globe, people recognize, people outside of movement spaces recognize that it's a crisis, that it's a global health crisis.
Yeah. As both a survivor and an activist, what was the importance for you, for people to finally be able to write down those words or say those words, Me Too?
Well, it was hard for me to say them myself, right? The first time I was able to articulate it. So I understand what it takes for a person to bring something. I think people don't realize the trauma of sexual violence and what it leaves you with. And so to even be able to say the words "Me Too" for some people is a Herculean effort. And so when I started seeing people write it down, type it on the internet, share it on social media, I actually had two reactions. The first was, overwhelmed, obviously, in seeing the outpouring. The other one was sort of protective, right? Because there was this outpouring of people sharing the most intimate, the most, traumatic thing that has happened to them. And it was not really protection around them, right? They weren't like safeguards and safe rails, because social media is not really a safe space all the time, right? At all, right? Yeah. And so I did feel a way about watching people do that without having guardrails.
What kind of guardrails have developed since then?
Well, I mean, it was one of the reasons why we started MeToo International, our organization, because we thought we needed to insert ourselves inside of what was happening in the public to help, our work is about healing and action. And so from the healing side, it's like, I have watched survivors, particularly survivors of color, Black survivors, so any survivor that is pushed to the margins, not have the kind of resources they need to heal, to thrive. And so with the things that we've developed since the hashtag has gone viral are that digital resources, we call it digital direct service, to help people find and craft their own healing journey. Some of that was really not possible and not available before MeToo went viral.
Well, lately there have been some names that have been dominating the news around these very issues. One of those names is convicted sex offender and financier Jeffrey Epstein. Yes. He, of course, died in his jail cell in 2019. There's been recent attention over the release of the highly anticipated Epstein files and what the new documents might reveal about some of the most powerful people in the world, politicians, academics, global leaders, just to name a few. Do you think this renewed attention could lead to new levels of accountability and maybe get some kind of justice for survivors?
I want to be careful with my answer. I think that I've had skepticism about these files because I'm just like, we have the survivors, right? And the survivors tell the story. They are the story. And in some ways, the clamoring about the files is a way to not pay attention to the survivors, right? Who are right here and telling you this is what happened. And so it's sort of, for me, it surfaced this whole idea that survivors are not enough. Our stories are not enough, right? But in other ways, what I do appreciate about this fervor around the files is that I don't know if it's going to bring down leaders or expose whatever, but it will make legible these intricate systems that exist that help perpetuate this violence, right?
Say more about those systems.
So sexual violence doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? And there are systems that exist that allow for them to happen. So a lot of times the way we think about sexual violence, the way the average person thinks about it is individual. This person harmed that person. This person is bad. That person needs help. And while that's true on a very, very, very small level, when you take a 30,000 feet look, there's a bigger thing at play. There are systems in patriarchy is a system, right? That's about power and dominance, right? So the capitalism is there's all of these different systems that exist. And when you think about an Epstein, when you expose his files, or when we get to see behind the curtain, I think what's important about that is to make legibility, to me, is the step before accountability. And most people don't really understand. They look at the one perpetrator, the one person that caused harm. But when you have an Epstein, that person can't exist by themselves. So he is a person pulling levers inside of a system. And so what's sort of exciting, if you will, about the possibility of exposing that is that we rarely get a glimpse inside of one of these systems, inside of how these things operate. And people, that needs to be made legible. So the accountability is not just, well, we need to get Ghislaine Maxwell and Epstein, and then no. You need to understand the people and the things and the entities and the institutions that either look the other way or
it seems like it seems like they even normalize it sometimes.
Absolutely, not sometimes, most of the time.
When I look at Hollywood, when I look at the music industry, we hear conversations in everyday talk where people are like, well, that's just how the business works. You expect that somebody's going to have sex with an executive.
Exactly. This is exactly why we have this framework called solvability that's both a narrative and a strategic intervention into sexual and gender-based violence, because most of us have been socialized to think about sexual and gender-based violence as inevitable. It's a way of life, right? We socialize, particularly young girls, on how to keep themselves safe. But we are not really looking at the fact that there are solutions. The systems are built so they can be dismantled. There are solutions to sexual and gender-based violence that exist in the world. This can be solved, and it can be solved in our lifetimes even, if the solutions that exist are scaled and they're resourced. But first of all, we have to make legible what the systems are and who the people are who are pulling the levers inside of the system. Epstein is a way to expose some of that, so that people can see this is how it works. And he's not an anomaly, right? What always happens with these big names is you got a Weinstein or an Epstein or an R. Kelly or a Russell Simmons or whatever, and we keep them as individual people that are like individual boogeymen. And people need to know that he is an example of what's happening. It doesn't have to be the billionaire Epstein. It could be the thousandaire right here, in your neighborhood. But they are perpetuating, using their power, their influence, and their resources to perpetuate these systems that keep the violence going.
And it seems that the example that they're setting is that there aren't very many consequences for the violence. Those named in connection with Epstein have faced little to no consequences. For example, the British royal family's Prince Andrew settled a civil lawsuit for sexual assault in 2022. And this year he was stripped of his royal title. Former Harvard University President Larry Summers recently resigned from the board of OpenAI over newly surfaced emails with Epstein. Yet only one person, Ghislaine Maxwell, has been criminally convicted as part of Epstein's sexual trafficking of minors. What does true accountability look like, though? Both for the individual accused, but also the system that you're talking about.
I get asked this question a lot. And usually when I talk about accountability, I like to talk about it on a spectrum. Because sexual violence happens on a spectrum, so accountability should happen on a spectrum, right? What happens to the person in the office who is harassing the coworker is not the same thing that happens to a Jeffrey Epstein who was perpetuating this kind of violence, or the people who support him. But I think, again, why I talk about legibility before accountability is so that people can understand who the bad actors are, and then we can look at what accountability looks like. But accountability, for me, always starts with the people who are harmed. So what do the survivors want? Right. What is it that's going to we have to start there as a baseline. I think people who come in with these various solutions, well, they should definitely do this and they should definitely do that, nobody can make that assumption, presumption, or decision for the survivors. So I had my own opinions about Epstein and the files, but I listened to what these survivors were saying. They said these files should be released. They want them exposed. If that's what they want, and if that feels like that's something that speaks to the harm that they caused, then that's what accountability looks like.
Did you have reservations about that?
I don't know if I had reservations as much as I was pessimistic. I just feel like survivors of sexual violence in particular, sexual and gender-based violence, get used as political. It's like political football, right? I saw the same thing with Christine Blasey Ford. We've seen the same thing with when it's expedient for either side, whatever, blue, red, whatever, however you identify, then all of a sudden they care about sexual violence, right? And I mean, Epstein was first convicted in 2008.
Yeah.
These files have been around. These files have been around forever. The information is out there. So I just feel like if you really wanted it, you could have had it. We had a Democrat in office for 4 years, and I didn't hear a word about Epstein, And so I just feel a way if the whole idea of exposing these files is just for political reasons, that's not okay. That's not okay, because what you do is you're doing that on the backs of children who are now adults who are harmed. Yeah. And we have to, if people feel okay with that, then that's a problem. And I think it's just where my reservation came from. I've seen this over and over again. We care about sexual violence. The world or the country cares about sexual violence when it's politically expedient for them.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I can't help but bring up Donald Trump, one of those people who's been tied to Epstein, but also has his own universe of problems in addition to Epstein.
At least 26.
I was going to say, I mean, he's been accused dozens of times, to your point, of sexual assault and misconduct. Now, some attribute the momentum around MeToo in 2017 partly to Trump being elected, even after his taped comments about assaulting women were made public. Then he gets elected again in 2024. After being found liable for sexual abuse.
By the same people who are now upset about the Epstein files, right? You see, so like, make it make sense for me. This is a man who has been very, very clear about how he feels about women. This is a person who was found liable for sexual assault, right? And has been credibly accused several times, including by a grown woman who was a child during the Epstein times, right? Like, these accusations have been built on and on and on. People know them. They're really clear about them. And even if you hadn't heard a single accusation against him, you heard his voice on air saying what he likes to do to women, right? And so it's hard for me to balance that with the anger and the fervor about the Epstein files, and we want to know if he's in the Epstein files. But you voted for this man. You think that he's not capable of doing what what Epstein did, what the accuser said?
Are you surprised by the second election based on everything you just said? Or did you think this is where we would be after, particularly given all the growth and expansion of the Me Too movement, the shifting sensibilities? Did you think this could happen?
I don't want to say I thought it could. I didn't know what could happen, but I knew the backlash was going to be big. I knew that the backlash. Listen, patriarchy is so deeply entrenched in this country, right? It's as American as apple pie. And anything that comes up against that, anything that challenges that, anything that challenges those norms, and that is, again, not political, not about people's political affiliations, but it made people so uncomfortable. I tell this story sometimes, and people may have heard it, but about the woman who I met at the in the bathroom at the Christine Blasey Ford hearing, and who was on our side, allegedly, and who stopped me to talk about how she wished that Christine Blasey Ford would I wish she could just remember more. I wish she could tell the story differently. And it was like, if she could cut and bleed a little bit more for you, if she could pull out a little more trauma, if she could just be something, give you some more political theater, that might move the needle. And I get strategically how people are thinking, but your strategy cannot override somebody's humanity. Even right now in this moment where people want to release the Epstein files, across the board, let me tell you something. One of my favorite people in the world is Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley. She is a survivor. She's talked about being a survivor publicly. She supports our work. She was early and she was loud about her support of survivors. When you look at how she talks about this issue, She's always survivor-centered. And right, she's an example of how to approach that. If you compare that to how you see others across the political spectrum talking about this, it is always about a means to an end. And that end is not about we need to reduce the sexual violence in this country or we need to expose how deeply intrinsic. No, it's about maybe this can get this move in the political chessboard, move these people around. And again, then we become the fodder, right? We become the fallout and the casualties of that. And that is why I have so much reservation about it. To your question about was I surprised? I was not surprised. I mean, I was surprised. Let me not lie. I was surprised. I was surprised, but I'm just not surprised at how deep the backlash is. Because when you try any attempt to tear away and dismantle these systems that are so deeply entrenched is going to be met with backlash. And really, that's how progress works in movements, right? There's some progression, and then there's deep backlash, and then we have to make up for that and have a little, and you try to move the rock a little bit further and further up the hill every time. What happened when Me Too went viral is that we got more things, I would say, in the last 8 years, because we're at 8 years now. We probably got more things done in the landscape of the movement to end sexual and gender-based violence in these 8 years than we would have gotten done in probably 20 years without the viral hashtag. And it's still not nearly enough.
The Democrats are often seen as the allies of the Me Too movement. And yet, in New York, prominent figures in the Democratic establishment endorsed New York Governor Andrew Cuomo when he was running or making a primary bid for mayor of New York, despite the fact that he had resigned from the governor's office in disgrace.
That's right.
For sexual harassment allegations. How do we square that?
Do I look surprised?
You don't.
Not at all. Not at all. Because the thing I've learned, and again, in these last 8 years, as being, elevated to a national figure, I get to be in some rooms that I would never have been in when I was organizing in the community. And what I've watched, doesn't matter how you identify, women, men, across the gender spectrum, people want power. Power and again, we think about Democrats and we think about, they are more closely aligned with social justice and whatever. But at the end of the day, they want power. Even if that power is, in their minds, a means to an end that's to benefit the people, it's about power. So you can sacrifice the survivors, right? We are an easy thing to sacrifice if you can get the power that you want to move this agenda forward. This is how I see the thinking work. And I cannot subscribe to something that will sacrifice people's humanity for the sake of power. And that's what happens over and over and over again in all these different instances. You will allow, at the very last minute, you'll hear a lot of conversation, a lot of talking, a lot of lip service, but when the rubber meets the road, they're going to go where the power is.
Thinking about that power dynamic, I can't help but return to some of these big Hollywood figures. Harvey Weinstein, producer and convicted sex offender, in some ways his takedown almost helped define the Me Too movement for many people.
Yeah.
But last year, one of his rape convictions was overturned. Bill Cosby had a reckoning, and that sort of collapsed after his sexual assault conviction was overturned. Diddy is serving time for sex crimes, but was found not guilty of the harsher charge of sex trafficking. What do you say to the person who says this indicates a shortcoming or a failure of the Me Too movement?
Why are you blaming us? I find it fascinating that people would blame the movement that is working to end these things for these failures. You think that in 8 years that this movement, or in even the 30 or 40 or 50 years that people have been working prior to Me Too, to undo these systems. I want to go back to that earlier conversation about systems. What we're talking about here is this system of justice in America that was not designed to give accountability or any kind of favor to most people, but to survivors of sexual violence for sure. And then you add on, in the case of Diddy, you're talking about Black women, right? Like, there are layers of here. Justice for women, accountability for women. We're talking about a patriarchal system. We're talking about an American legal system, American justice system. In the case of Cosby, you know that there was a precedent there, right? Yeah. He had met the legal system before, and there was an agreement made not to move forward. In the case of Weinstein, there's probably thousands of people around that knew exactly who that man was and made sure to protect him. Why? Not did they believe in rape and sexual assault? Probably not. What they believed in is money and power, and he had a lot of it. He allowed a lot of people to gain money and power and privilege, and they wanted to protect that. So yes, to get people with that level of power into a courtroom, and it's not even to say I believe in the court system, whatever, but it's what we have.
Yeah.
So to get them into a courtroom is progress. To have, I remember in the Diddy case, one of the young women who testified talked about they asked her why hadn't she come forward or something like that, and she said, well, you couldn't do that before Me Too. This happened before Me Too went viral, right? And I'm like, this is a point that I need people who say that it's the movement's fault or this is a failure of the movement to hear. The work that we are doing is about, outside of the healing work for sure, the action work is to confront these systems, but it's also to reshape the narrative that people have about sexual violence, right? I think that we have new understanding, new analysis around this, and this is a long battle. It's a long battle. So I don't see any of those as losses. I see those as, I won't even call them wins. I see them as advancement in the work that we're doing.
You've called sexual violence a public health crisis, and your work has, in particular, focused on Black women and girls who are disproportionately impacted by sexual abuse. Indigenous people and trans women also face higher rates of sexual violence as well. It's worth noting. How important is centering marginalized groups in solutions like harm reduction, prevention, or education even?
It is the most important thing. I think one of the mistakes that most movements make, but I think even in social impact kind of things, we are not starting with the people who are most impacted. You have to start with the people who are most deeply impacted. And I mean, this is what Black feminism taught me, right? And everybody gets served. And so in this country, Indigenous women, who we just absolutely don't talk about, and I mean, we don't talk about them in many ways, but we certainly don't talk about them in relation to sexual and gender-based violence. Indigenous women have the highest rate of sexual violence in this country, followed by Black women, right? And it is critical that we find solutions for the people who are the most underserved. And Black women is, at the heart of my work. In this country, we are not flanking sexual and gender-based violence alongside other social justice issues, even though it lives inside of almost every issue that you can think of. And it lives inside of every issue that we care that we're passionate about. You want to solve mass incarceration, you can't do that without dealing with sexual and gender-based violence. You want to solve police brutality, you want to solve the climate crisis. You can't talk about those things without dealing with sexual and gender-based violence. You can't even solve the issue of mass shootings in this country, because there's a statistic that says that something like 66% of all mass shooters have a history of gender-based violence. So how are we going to stop mass shootings in this country if we're not addressing the root cause of why these people are going out and committing these things? We cannot keep bastardizing sexual violence as a social justice issue, and anything that happens every 68 seconds is absolutely a public health crisis.
When the final story on Me Too is told, what do you want it to be?
Oh, I think that I would be incredibly pleased if our final story was, look at how far they pushed this work. Look at how much the needle has moved. Look at how we understand this differently. We understand we operate differently, not because of a hashtag, right? I'm grateful for the hashtag, and I will always be grateful for that amplification. But the work, the everyday work that has nothing to do with an Epstein or a Weinstein in a daily sense, that has nothing to do with what people are seeing in Hollywood and on television, but it has to do with the material lives of people who are experiencing this violence and the lives of people most vulnerable and susceptible to experiencing the violence. I want people to say, you all did an incredible job in helping us find solutions and helping people understand that this is solvable. And so now my children don't grow up thinking about just how to keep themselves safe, but understanding that they are part of the solutions, because survivors are architects of possibility. And I want people to see that and understand that and know that, because this is a movement that elevated survivors in that way.
Tarana Burke, thank you so much for joining me on UpFront.
Thank you.